Well, good afternoon, friends, and that was lovely. First of all, it's lovely that you are here. My name is Malcolm, I'm one of the ministers here, and it was also lovely to hear some of Handel's Messiah there. I know that my Redeemer liveth, coming from the book of Job, and that's a wonderful piece, and if you're around and interested, you can hear not only that, but you can hear the full version of Handel's Messiah this coming Friday night, and we can give you some more details about that today. Well, again, welcome to St Andrew's Cathedral. Thanks for taking time out during this week and during, for many of you, your lunch break today to come in to hear this public lecture, which is entitled The Resurrection of Jesus, Long on Faith, Short on History. And you'll notice it's got a question mark at the end. This is an opportunity for us to reflect and to think, and that's what we're going to be doing today as we listen to a public lecture given by the Dean of the Cathedral here. But I do want to welcome you. I also want to highlight just around here to my right and to your left, there are bathrooms here. Just to give you a lay of the land as well, we will go from now until about 1:50, and so hopefully you can enjoy your time there. I do want to let you know that there will be an opportunity today for you to ask questions of Sandy. And in just a moment, there's a little QR code that you're probably familiar with after being in COVID for the last 2 years. You just get your device and you can put it in front of, you can zoom in on that. Otherwise, you can go to slido.com and there's going to be a number there for questions. And Sandy welcomes questions here at the end. You might have questions about the resurrection, or you want some clarity as to something Sandy says during the presentation. And we'll put that barcode up again at the end, but slido.com, and you can see the number up there on the screen for the code. Well, let me just introduce to you Sandy Grant. Sandy is the new Dean of the Cathedral here at St Andrews, and he comes here after serving 17 years at the Cathedral of St Michael's down in Wollongong. Prior to that, he served on the ministry team at Kurrajong, out in the rural context, and also in a multicultural church at St John's Park. Sandy is married to Karen and the father of 3 adult daughters. A few other things about Sandy: he has campaigned over the last few years for poker machine reform. He has led also the development of the Sydney Anglican domestic violence policy. Sandy is a keen runner. It's not unusual to see him in a pair of shorts and hitting the pavements there. He's also a reader of theology, biography, and enjoys crime fiction. His only other job prior to going into ministry was to work at a bottle shop, and you might want to ask him about that a little bit later on. Maybe not in the question and answer time, but maybe grab him afterwards. I'm sure he's got a story or two to tell. He first learned about the historical method, which he'll be reflecting on today in regards to the life of Jesus, at Sydney Grammar School across from Hyde Park, and then later on he reflected on this further in his theological training as he earned a degree there. Sandy has lectured on topics as varied as William Wilberforce and the abolition of the slave trade. He has given lectures on the 500th anniversary of John Calvin's birth and on the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Version of the Bible, and he's also given several papers and presentations on defining and defending the classical Christian view of marriage. Yet in spite of all of these topics and all of these different forums, Sandy says that his favourite subject of all is the resurrection of Jesus. And so with that in mind, I'm going to welcome, and let us welcome, the Dean of Sydney, Sandy Grant, to present to us on this topic this afternoon. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you, Malcolm, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you, and also to know there are some watching online. I think probably the bottle shop usefulness was particularly useful, calculating the number of bottles that Jesus turned the water into wine, and my calculations are 600 to 800 bottles of quality red wine, I presume, that exceeds Grange Hermitage. I'm actually wishing, after Bill Shorten's comments about Anthony Albanese's mistake on the unemployment rate, that I'd title my lecture "The Perfection of Jesus, Long on Faith, Short on Evidence." But I'm sticking with the resurrection today. Friends, I was ordained a minister over 28 years ago, and soon afterwards, in 1994, as green as you can imagine, I took my first funeral. And as you can guess, I was pretty nervous. I was just 25, and we were waiting for the latecomers to take their seats. And as I stood at the chapel door, the undertaker's offsider, who was my own age, could not contain his surprise that someone so young was a minister. "What's in it for a bloke like you?" he asked. And religion is for old people was the implication. And with 60 seconds before we were due to start, I managed to say, "Well, I know where I'm going when I end up in one of those boxes," pointing at the coffin. My confidence came from the resurrection of Jesus. And I wonder if you could say the same thing. In some ways, I'm something of a sceptical personality. For example, I once wrote to my local paper at Fairfield complaining when they gave the astrology column a full page. Why so? Because I'd read a study in the top science journal, Nature, where astrologers had cooperated in designing the study and agreed it was fair, and the result? The astrologer's skill in picking which personality profile correctly matched a given horoscope was worse than chance. So I was a sceptic. I think we're foolish to trust something without some reasonable evidence. And that's the nub of the issue today. How strong is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? But there's another part of the topic which deserves consideration. It's the part which says the resurrection is long on faith, but short on evidence. And this seems to pit faith against evidence. Certainly, Richard Dawkins and company love to say that faith is belief without evidence, or even belief despite the evidence. And so I want to say right up front, this is a complete misunderstanding of what faith is, or at least what the Bible means by faith, and how most Christians understand it. In the Bible, faith is dependence or trust in another. And there may be more or less good reasons for trusting a particular thing or person. So, for example, if I let my young child play with a new friend from her new school under the care of that friend's parents, adults that I've never met, you might justifiably suggest that I was exercising blind faith. Didn't know the parents. And of course, some people have done this, often without problems. But on the other hand, if I observed the positive way those parents related towards the kids in the playground, enjoyed several conversations with the parents, and perhaps also received positive comments from the teacher about those parents, then most would agree I was right. I was justified to exercise faith in the parents and let my child go play at their house. This is not faith without evidence. And similarly, people who become Christians do so on the basis of various sorts of evidence. It may include recommendations from friends or observing the positive effect following Christ has on believers they know. But often it will include some investigation of the historical reliability of the Bible, which, by the way, is far better than the Da Vinci Code. So let me list several reasons why mainline historians have a quite high respect for the reliability of the New Testament. Firstly, it's important to know the documents are written close in time to the events they recorded. We can date Paul's letters and probably Mark and possibly Matthew, Luke and Acts all before 70 AD, since Acts is the latest and it makes no mention of major historical events such as the destruction of Jerusalem, AD 70, or the persecution of Christians by Nero in 64. And it means these documents were written within a lifetime of the same generation that lived them. Professor A.N. Sherwin-White, a preeminent historian of Greece and Rome, chides New Testament critics for not recognising the quality of the New Testament documents compared to sources he uses for Greco-Roman history of that time, usually removed from the events they describe by generations or even centuries. Secondly, under this heading of reliability of the New Testament documents, we just have a multiplicity of manuscript copies of the New Testament, far more than for any other literary work of ancient Greece or Rome. Thirdly, good scribal practices and subsequent linguistic research means that the texts have been reliably transmitted and translated. Now, although they're bound together in one book today, the New Testament evidence about Jesus includes multiple strands or sources, including Mark, John, James, Paul, a source common to Matthew and Luke, as well as Matthew and Luke's own independent materials. And this criteria of multiple attestation is an important one to ancient historians. Then there's an eyewitness flavour of the New Testament, with participants named, incidental details recorded, which likely could have only been known by those present. And this is backed up by the accuracy in the background details. So inscriptions have been discovered confirming indeed that Pontius Pilate was indeed governor of Judea. And ossuary, that's a bone container from burial sites. An ossuary has been found containing the bones of a crucified man, confirming the practice of nails going through the ankles and the hands, the wrists and so on. I had an assistant minister whose wife did her degree in archaeology. Her professor would often tell his classes that the Bible was one of the best sources of knowledge for life in the ancient Middle East. Indeed, the professor said, archaeologists learn far more from the Bible, so long as you disregard the miracles, than Bible readers could ever learn from archaeology. Well, apart from his lack of an open mind on the supernatural, this professor obviously held the New Testament in highest regard for its accurate portrayal of the details of life of the ancient world. It's also important to realise we can't prove the resurrection like some sort of mathematical equation, QED. The resurrection belongs to the realm of the personal and historical. And historical study allows us to talk only about the balance of probability. And here, so much depends on your presuppositions. If you refuse to admit the existence of God at all as a possibility, well then of course you'll do your best to explain away every bit of evidence to the contrary. But if you're open to the idea that God is there, well then why would you insist that he must be unemployed and inactive? So I'm saying yes, the bar should be high for an astonishing claim like a resurrection. But for myself, I've found the evidence persuasive. And I'm referring today to three strands in particular. Firstly, the empty tomb. Secondly, the multiple eyewitnesses who claim to have seen Jesus alive after death. And thirdly, the changed lives of those disciples who founded the Christian church in the face of threats to desist. And it's to this evidence I now turn. Strand 1, the empty tomb. The origin of the Christian faith is impossible without it. Christianity was founded in the same city where Jesus was publicly killed, executed, and buried, with thousands coming to believe in him within the space of a few months. His tomb must have been empty, otherwise the authorities simply would have produced the body from the tomb. Now, the written accounts, and these are attested in two of the sources, Mark and John, they describe the burial. These are widely recognised by scholars as historically credible. It's highly unlikely, they reason, that a story involving Joseph of Arimathea burying Jesus in his own tomb could have survived if fictitious, since Joseph was a well-known member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, or ruling council. And so the gravesite was well known. And to repeat, no one would have believed unless the tomb was empty. Otherwise, the Jewish authorities could have exhumed the body to expose the whole charade. And so even though they had every reason to want to refute Christianity, they could never produce the body of Jesus. In fact, the earliest anti-Christian propaganda confirms the tomb was empty. So Matthew, in his unique source, reports the Jewish leaders did not deny the tomb was empty. Rather, they tried to provide an explanation by claiming the disciples stole the body. And you've got to ask yourself, why would Matthew invent that counterclaim and put it into his work and potentially sow seeds of doubt unless that alternative story was circulating widely? Which is, of course, strong evidence that the tomb itself was widely known to be empty from an early point of time. You could add too that the Apostle Paul's testimony implies the tomb was empty. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 and 4, that letter itself is dated to 55 AD, he said he received and passed on to the Corinthians, round about AD 51, as tradition, that is, as fixed teaching, that Christ had died, was buried, and rose on the third day. Now, since Jewish ideas of resurrection were very bodily and physical, it's impossible for Paul to have said this if the bones were still there. This saying dates very early, since scholars agree Paul learned this tradition formula in his first couple of years as a convert. And if you do the timing, you could ask me about it if you wish, it works out to learning the tradition not later than AD 35 to 36, when he first visited Jerusalem after his conversion and spoke with Peter and James. Now that's no more than about 2 or an outside 6 years after the resurrection, and this really is too little time for a legend to displace factual memory. Might also consider that the burial and empty tomb account in Mark is also based on a very early source. Now, how could we infer this? Because the high priest is mentioned without using his name, whereas in Matthew and John, who write later, Caiaphas is named as the high priest, and this implies that when Mark wrote, Caiaphas was still high priest. If it had only been passed on to Mark after Caiaphas finished his term of office, his name would have been used to distinguish him from the subsequent high priest, but Mark had no need of that. We know from Josephus that Caiaphas was high priest 18 to 37 AD, which suggests that this burial empty tomb tradition was circulating no later than 37 AD, once again, well within the first decade of the event it describes. So, the conclusion here is just to observe that in scholarly circles, the move has been on balance towards accepting the historicity of the empty tomb of Jesus, since it's very difficult to refute on evidential grounds. The respected Cambridge historian of the classical period, Michael Grant, no relation to me, wrote, "The historian cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb. If we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed empty." Well, the second strand, the appearances. The four Gospels and the other New Testament sources, like Paul's letters, give us a mix of sources, some independent, some partly dependent on earlier sources. A study of all these sources gives us up to 12 incidents of Jesus appearing after his death and burial, dating from the third day after his death and onwards. And I'm just going to list these resurrection appearances for you. Firstly, Mary Magdalene at the cemetery, early morning Sunday. That's John 20. Then various women, including Mary Magdalene, but another Mary and others, returning from the tomb. That's in Matthew 28. Then there are two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Only one is named, Cleopas, which suggests possibly that Cleopas was the source of the report Luke records in chapter 24. Then there's Peter on his own, Luke 24. The disciples with Thomas absent, that's Luke 24, John 20. And then the disciples with Thomas present a week later in John 20, and probably 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 5 verse 6 mentions 500 at one time, most of whom Paul writes were still alive at the time of writing. Then there's James, the brother of Jesus, also 1 Corinthians 15. 7 disciples at the lake of Tiberias in Galilee, that's John 21. Then 11 disciples and others on a mountain in Galilee, that's Matthew 28. And then the disciples at Jesus' ascension to heaven, that's Luke 24 and Acts 1 and 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7 possibly. And later, Paul on the Damascus Road, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 8 and Acts 9, 22 and 26. Now look, there is some uncertainty as to the precise sequence and the degree of overlap between some of those that I've listed. But I calculate 10 or more occasions, both individuals and groups claim to have seen the risen Jesus alive. And the names of many of those to whom Jesus appeared are recorded or were readily ascertainable. And this means those claims are unlikely to have been late legends. Paul mentioned, you heard, many witnesses who are still alive. This is an accepted historiography in his day, the appeal to witnesses, some of whom could be cross-examined. It would have been hard to claim that in writing if there were not real people around to back up his claim. Well, contrast the urban myth. You ever hear the one about the man with dreadlocks who went to hospital with redback spider bites nesting in his hair? And you can never track down the source. Which hospital was he taken to? The story vanishes into thin air. Sometimes it's said the names attached to the gospel events they're just late creations to give it a sense of plausibility, invented by the gospel authors, adding credibility. Interesting observation is that in most cases where Mark, remember he wrote first, when Mark mentions names, it's Luke and Matthew who wrote later who tend to drop the names when they report the same event. Because presumably as time went by, the named persons were no longer so widely alive or as well known, and so their names could be omitted as less relevant. In addition, the fact women are listed as the first witnesses of the empty tomb and of the appearances of Jesus adds a further credibility. Distasteful as this sounds, it is since women had a low status in the first century society and their testimony was heavily discounted in courts of law. It would have been counterproductive to invent a story with this detail of early female witnesses unless the detail was true. So, we know the names of multiple witnesses circulating first in oral form immediately after the event and then embedded in written history within a mere 2 decades after the event. And so again, I'm suggesting that on historical grounds, it's hard to deny that numerous people had experiences they interpreted as the appearance of the risen Jesus. And the more sources who basically say the same thing, well, then the greater historians normally rate the likelihood of their truthfulness. Well, we move now to Strand 3 and explaining the origin of the whole Christian movement. Because you may not know, but there were a number of messianic prophets from that general first century era, 100 years either side or so. Each of them attracted followers at the time, but their movements died with them. Virtually nothing of their deeds or words have survived. Contrast Christianity. Jesus was survived by a movement which went from strength to strength. It quickly outgrew the gathering he'd accumulated in Palestine during his earthly ministry till it burst international boundaries. Well, there's got to be an explanation for this powerful whirl of activity. Now, indeed, most sceptical historians admit the existence of a belief that Jesus rose from the dead, even if they prefer a different explanation for how that belief arose. But where did the belief come from? There's got to be an adequate historical cause for it. Now, Jewish background beliefs at the time did expect a bodily resurrection, but they only expected it right at the end of human history as we knew it. That is, there would be a general resurrection of all Israelites, all the righteous, but certainly not at all occurring earlier in the middle of history like was being claimed with Jesus. And so some sort of expectancy doesn't really explain it happening back then when Jesus walked the earth. Some of you may have heard of alleged pagan parallels that the Christians have supposedly copied, like Isis or Horus rising. Well, these parallels are just not tenable. The parallels are weak. The pagan stories, for instance, are not actually about historical people, but about legendary characters, Marvel figures, the equivalent of superheroes. Most of the alleged parallels of rising deities actually post-date the time of Jesus. And I would be very surprised if any of you can provide a securely dated textual example dating prior to the late 2nd century. In fact, if anything, it seems the 2nd and 3rd century pagan religions started borrowing resurrection ideas from Christianity rather than vice versa. And further, one can observe that the Greeks tended to believe in the immortality of the soul, not of the body. And so none of that explains it either. Where did the transformation of the disciples come from? They were devastated and emotionally defeated after Jesus' execution. And history records that typically the death of a great leader is followed by strife and division. But the reverse occurred with the disciples. Something happened to cause them to become bold and courageous and outspoken. Peter famously changed from cowardly denier to bold proclaimer of the resurrection. Thomas changed from doubter to believer. In addition, skeptics were changed, for James and Jesus' other half-brothers did not believe in Jesus during his teaching ministry. What changed their mind to accept that their brother was actually the Lord God in the flesh. James died a martyr's death for this belief in 62 AD. Likewise, Paul of Tarsus had been a key opponent, a persecutor of Christianity to the point of approving the killing of Christians. Something happened to change Paul from number one persecutor into number one missionary. Now, these men I've just named weren't actually all agreed on precise matters of Christian mission and practice. There were tensions between their followers which are a matter of record. The Bible honestly records it over, for example, observing the Jewish law and how much was it necessary, or the basis for mission to the Gentiles, all the nations with their message. But they were all united in their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. James, Peter, and Paul each served the message of the risen Jesus for over 3 decades. It's difficult to believe they would have done this unless they were convinced Jesus really was alive from the dead. And if they were liars, do you really think they would have kept suffering for so long and then indeed died for what they knew was a lie? Well, today I've presented several facts agreed by many ancient historians: that Jesus truly died and his tomb was empty by Sunday, that Many claimed soon after to have seen him appear, and then the church's origin with founders willing to suffer for their claims of the resurrection. The historians go to the universities, they dispute the interpretation of these facts. They don't, in the secular world, certainly all agree that the resurrection is the best explanation. But this raw data, my 3 strands, is agreed as historically solid by a wide range of scholars, Jewish and Christian, Catholic and Protestant, sceptical, agnostic, even some atheists. And I believe that means the resurrection hypothesis must be taken seriously as a theory, unless by philosophical bias you've closed your mind to God's existence. Antony Flew, was one of the 20th century's foremost philosophy professors. And near the end of his life, impressed by arguments for intelligent design, he abandoned atheism for theism, though he did not become a Christian. But Professor Flew did say this: the evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. And having given you the historical, I want to say it really matters personally. Life and death are at stake. Indeed, we believe eternity. You know, since that first funeral almost 30 years ago that I took, I've taken well over 100 more. Late last year, the barrister with whom I first debated my advertised topic today, just a year or two older than me, Martin died suddenly of a heart attack. At the cold, hard grave, it really matters where you're going when you end up in one of those boxes. I'm a big fan of Paul Kelly, not the political commentator or the AFL footballer, but this time Australia's, I consider, greatest living songwriter. And perhaps my favourite tune of all is a lesser-known song he wrote called Deeper Waters, Deeper Water. And it's about a little boy growing up and through the teenage experiences, young love, partnering up and having a kid, and then in their 30s, I guess it would be, his wife gets cancer and dies. And in the song, as she gets close to death, she says, "Where I'm going next, I'm going alone, deeper waters." And Paul Kelly in his song prefers to go on with the cycle of life with the widower trying to raise his young boy alone. But it does make you ask, where are you going next? Are you going alone? Christians are confident that they are not alone when they enter those deeper waters. C.S. Lewis said, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important." I'll pass back to Malcolm to field some questions.
Let's thank Sandy for that presentation, first of all. Thank you, Sandy. You'll see just above you there is a QR code. We've had a couple of questions come in, but I'll give you a chance to look at that. You can go to Slido, slido.com. The number there is 146147. That will take you to the right page to be able to ask a question. And just as we do that, we have come to the end of our presentation. We're going to have about 10 minutes or so of question and answer. So if you need to leave at this time, you're welcome to leave. But I do, as you consider what's going on here this week at the Cathedral, I wanted to highlight a few important things. As you leave, or just on the other side here, and you might have even received this coming in, we've got some handouts here indicating different activities going on during Holy Week here at the Cathedral. Wanted to highlight a couple for you. First of all, and there's also some postcards that you will receive. One of the services we have here during the week, every week actually, Wednesday night, it's a wonderful service for people who are asking these really big questions of life. Where is God in the pain? Where is God when life hurts? Where can I get help? It's a wonderful service every Wednesday at 6 p.m, the healing service, and you'll find information about that on a postcard. Then this coming Friday, we have Good Friday service here at the Cathedral at 10 a.m. And once again, our Dean Sandy will be preaching at that. Friday night, we have Handel's Messiah, as I highlighted earlier on. There are still tickets available for that. It's a wonderful evening to come and just hear quality music, but also to hear the scriptures and the gospel sung to us. And I've really appreciated that over many years. And then finally, on Sunday, Easter Sunday is one of the highlights, if not the highlight of the Christian calendar. It's the day we celebrate Jesus not only died, but that he rose again from the dead. And this is a great service. If you want to come, there's going to be plenty of availability. You'll hear some good singing, but most importantly, we'll be focusing on Jesus' resurrection. Also, just wanted to highlight that we have, if you're interested as a result of today, or you're just interested in finding more about Christianity, after Easter, shortly after Easter, the Sunday following Easter Sunday, we are going to start a 5-week course called Simply Christianity. This is a great opportunity if you're new to the Christian faith or you've got questions. You might say, look, I'm not yet a Christian, but I want to find out more. This is a great course. This is a course for you. It doesn't cost you money. It's not something that we've sort of got some plan to plug you into the church. This is for genuine people who want to know more about the Christian faith. And we'll be offering that. You can find information on the bulletin. And if you speak Mandarin, you can also discover that there's a Mandarin course that we'll be running as well. All right, so some of those things could be helpful for you, but we do have a few moments for questions. So I'm going to, you might have it there in front of you as well, Sandy, but we've got a couple of questions here. First question, what about contradictions in the accounts of Jesus' resurrection? E.g., Mark is different than Luke is different than John.
Sometimes I'm a bit cheeky when people raise that, and I always ask them, can you give me the specific example of the contradiction you're thinking of? And mostly they've just heard the claim made and haven't actually looked into it themselves. But there are some, I think rather than contradictions, I'd call them discrepancies. So, for example, there are variations that I would say are natural from different eyewitness predictions. If you read the Sunday morning resurrection account where the stone is rolled away from the tomb, the different Gospels, some say it's still dark, some say it's dawn, some say just after sunrise, that the women went to the tomb. That's how the different Gospels put it. Well, I tend to think that probably just depends a little bit on how you personally describe the very early morning, or exactly when you're looking back at the events, exactly when did you remember it, you think of it starting. Some Gospels mention one angel being present at the tomb, one Gospel mentions 2. Well, maybe the version which mentioned just the one Gospel was focusing on the angel who actually was said to speak to the eyewitnesses, or maybe that witness just didn't notice the second angel. There are kind of plausible, normal explanations. Over the years, I've spoken to a number of police officers about this in various contexts, and they say that minor variations in witness statements are typical. Different witnesses of the same event will notice or emphasise different features in that event. And judges are in fact more suspicious if various witness reports describe the event word for word the same. That's when they suspect collusion, not with reasonable variation on a consistent theme. And I'm not aware of any gospel differences for which there aren't plausible explanations. In fact, what we have is far more consistent than the 3 historians who narrate the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. And those historians' accounts disagree about where Nero was during the fire, and they disagree. Have you ever heard about Nero fiddling while Rome burned? They disagree about whether he was fiddling or playing the lyre or singing while the city burned. None of them doubt that Nero failed to show leadership while his capital city was destroyed. Or more recently, the Titanic when it sank? Some witnesses, from the water, said the hull split in 2. There were other survivors who insisted that the Titanic sank in one piece. At the time, both the official UK and US inquiries concluded the Titanic sank whole. It was only James Cameron's exploration, the undersea explorer, that proved the Titanic did break in two. But despite differences in eyewitness testimony, of course, no one disputed the main point: the Titanic sank. And I'm saying Jesus rose.
Okay, Sandy, a bit of a slightly different question. There's several excellent questions here. Two or three of them probably asking the same question.
Good. Yep.
Couldn't Jesus' appearance have been a vision connected to this? Why is it important theologically? And one last one here. Is belief in physical resurrection of Jesus a matter of freedom, or is it a non-negotiable?
That's a brilliant series of questions, isn't it? Let's start with the vision question. People come up with the idea that it was a vision because they're trying to find an alternative for the psychological conviction that Jesus appeared. So they say, oh, it must have been a vision. Wishful thinking, perhaps, mass hallucination. It would be worth asking such people, have you actually examined the science of vision, of hallucination? Hallucinations do tend to be individual and under favourable circumstances. That is, when there's expectancy. It's a bit like if you're hypnotised, it helps if you're an expectant kind of personality. Well, that was not the situation of the women approaching the tomb with what kind of spices were they bringing? Burial spices. Now, I've read scientific investigations suggesting only 15% of the population have ever experienced a hallucination in their lifetime. And of that group, only 14% of the 15% had visible hallucinations. Well, this hallucination vision theory would have us believe that 100% of the disciples present experienced the very same visible, tangible hallucinations, often simultaneously and on more than one occasion. And I just think it takes considerable credulity to believe that far-fetched natural explanation. Jesus took the trouble to eat fish in the presence of his disciples to assure them it wasn't just a ghostly appearance. Now, does it matter? Well, the Bible's worldview is very positive towards the physical. God created the world, all the different animals, the flowers, said it was very good. The physical world is very good. And he created humans, not just as souls on sticks, as I sometimes say, but embodied souls. And the fact that Jesus is raised physically, recognisably, to live forever is something of great significance. And I would say it is, in the end, not negotiable for Christians. You're still figuring it out, fair enough. Keep asking the questions, testing the theories. But Christians, and it'll happen this Sunday, this Good Friday, this Sunday, we'll stand and in our recognised creeds, binding us in unity, down through the ages and across the globe, we'll say we believe that Jesus rose and that we believe in the resurrection of the dead, indeed the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. And so it is fundamental to our belief statements.
Thank you, Sandy. A question here, and you may have answered a little bit, but just for clarity, somebody asks, can I say I don't believe in the resurrection, but I like Jesus and want to follow him?
Well, you certainly can say it. I've heard people say that, and that applies to some other aspects of Jesus' deeds or teaching that they're not convinced about yet. And I want to say, look, that's a good start. If you see things about Jesus in the historical records, and that's all, objectively, that's all we have apart from our own subjective thinking and I would say the influence of God on us. If that's what you've got to start with, keep pursuing that hunch. But it doesn't make sense to kind of take him half off, because Jesus made claims that are greater than simply a prophet's claim, a great man's claim. He made claims about his identity as the Son of God, eternally in relationship with the Father, and that predicting he would not only die but come back from the dead and so on. That put him into a class above just a great teacher. And so I want to say that it's an unstable position to conclude in. It's a good position to be starting in as you explore who Jesus is. It's an unstable position to remain in. I don't think it's sustainable ultimately.
Okay, maybe one last question. We've got a couple more questions, and if we didn't get your question, I think Sandy will be around here for a little bit afterwards, as I will be as well. But last question here, before maybe you can just share some closing thoughts. Is the resurrection alone a reason to believe in Jesus?
Yeah, I think in the end the answer is yes, and yet the evidence for the resurrection doesn't come to us alone. It comes at the end of multiple chapters, we turn them into chapters for convenient reference, of the biography of Jesus beforehand, focusing mainly on the last few years of his adult life and a little bit about his birth, one or two bits of his childhood, giving us a lot about his teaching, a lot about his deeds of power and compassion. The resurrection, if you like, is the capstone, the pinnacle. And if you can accept that miracle, then why not accept other miracles? You've kind of concluded that God must be there. There must be some remarkable power at work in his life. And so I certainly think examining the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus with an open mind is a great way to crack open the whole question of the truth of Christianity.
Okay, final thoughts, Sandy? And then
Yeah, look, thank you. That's fine. We might put up the book recommendations if we can have them. I just wanted to say, if you want to look at an academic level, that's it. These two books have been tremendously helpful to me. They're very academic. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony, and The Resurrection of Jesus, a New Historiographical Approach. Chunky. They are readable, but they are academically heavy. At a popular level, these two books here, I've got multiple copies to give away. And if you're genuinely seeking after God, genuinely seeking after the resurrection, it would be my privilege to give you a free copy of either one today. John Dixon, PhD, Ancient History, public Christian speaker, just examines the historical question in a very, he's a believer, but he does it in a very neutral way, I consider. He doesn't try to overstate just the historical evidence, but he presents it fairly. And more broadly, 7 Reasons to Reconsider Christianity by Ben Shaw. He was John's guitarist in John's teenage Christian band when I was a teenager, and he died just last year of carcinoma, cancer in his jaw that in the end took his whole head. And he spoke very movingly about his continued conviction about the resurrection in the face of death that I mentioned more broadly early on, and I'd be glad to give you a copy. It deals with other issues that people have with Christianity and not just the historical resurrection one. Let's finish with a quote from good old Peter Hitchens, the brother of the late great atheist Christopher Hitchens, who was an atheist and socialist, and in later life came back to Christian belief and into the Anglican Church. He said on ABC Q&A in 2013, the most dangerous idea this is at the festival, Sydney Festival of Dangerous Ideas. The most dangerous idea in human history and philosophy remains the belief that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and rose from the dead, and that is the most dangerous idea you'll ever encounter. It alters the whole of human behaviour and all of our responsibilities. It turns the universe from a meaningless chaos into a designed place in which there is justice and there's hope. And therefore we all have a duty to discover the nature of that justice and work towards that hope. It alters us all. If we reject it, it alters us all as well. It is incredibly dangerous. And apologies for the misspelling in the last line.
Well, thank you again, Sandy, and thank you everybody for your attendance today. We hope this has been a helpful experience for you as you engage this critical and life-altering topic. Once again, we welcome you to join us here for any of our number of services at the Cathedral, and look forward to your presence here with us again. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Andy. Good on you.
Yeah, well done.